Approximately 400 rare paintings are found.
It all started with a wish. A woman's simple desire to leave 2 portraits of herself to the country she loved. The woman in the portraits is Adele Bloch-Bauer. Her husband, Ferdinand, commissioned Austrian painter Gustav Klimt to paint her portraits in the early 1900s. The 2 portraits and 3 Klimt landscapes were among the artworks taken from Ferdinand's home by the Nazis when they marched into Austria in 1938. For the past 60 years, the paintings were proudly displayed in the Austrian National Gallery's Belvedere Museum in Vienna. But when Los Angeles resident Maria Altmann, the niece of Ferdinand and Adele Bloch-Bauer, challenged Austria's ownership of the Klimt paintings, a legal tug-of-war began that lasted nearly a decade. Our story begins in New York City in 1997.
There was an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York at the end of 1997 where they had a number of Austrian paintings from a museum in Austria called the Leopold Foundation. 2 paintings by an artist named Egon Schiele, who was a contemporary of Klimt, a little bit younger, were then seized by the district attorney of New York as being Nazi-looted property.
Many conservative people in Austria were up in arms, thinking that Americans had no respect for private property, when in fact the subpoena was motivated by precisely the respect for private property, but a different definition from what the Austrians who opposed the subpoena believed.
As a result of the case being very high profile, it put a spotlight on Austria, not just generally its involvement in World War II. You know, were they the first victims of Nazism, or were they just part of the perpetrators, you know, like Nazi Germany? But specifically, it focused on something that was not talked about as much, and that is the Nazi looted art.
Actually, the question of looted art was never a big topic in the Austrian political discussion before. Suddenly, the public could recognize that there is a chapter of the Austrian history which has to be written totally new.
The Austrians responded with some indignation, I think, saying it's ridiculous, we don't have any looted paintings, you know, everything was returned after the war, this is an outrage. Hubertus Czernin decided to research and see if that was true, and he went into the files of the Austrian archives, the state archives, and discovered documentation showing how in the Bloch-Bauer family and in other families like the Austrian Rothschild family or the Lederer family, that the family lawyers had essentially been forced to donate certain paintings, donate in quotes, certain artworks to Austrian federal museums in order to get export permits for other paintings. So Hubertus Czernin wrote an expose in the Austrian papers.
And suddenly it became very clear, and it became very clear with a lot of media and international media attention, the kind of the level of involvement of Austrian institutions and in the question of, you know, of art theft and owning property that had been looted. And this came kind of in the wake of the Swiss bank scandal. It was really a very tense time when there was a lot of attention to kind of Holocaust-era assets. And Austria needed to react very, very quickly, which they did by enacting an art restitution law in November of 1998, which now governs the restitution of artworks from federal museums and public collections.
I would say the Austrians have done more since 1998 to return Holocaust victims' property than any other government in Europe or the entire world.
But we have never really advertised what until now we gave back, what we could return. Because everybody is scared that some people could feel, yes, reproach us that, now that you're finally, after 60 years, giving back a few things to some Jewish people, you think that you've done it all. And that's really the reason, I think, why they prefer not talking about it and saying, as long as the survivor himself gets the point that we do whatever we can, as late as it is, then it's enough for us. We don't want to go out to the world and say, look how good we are. Because we have for many years, and we are completely aware of it, not been okay or not done enough.
Restitution. The act of restoring to the rightful owner something that has been lost, stolen, or surrendered.
The Austrians' restitution policies after the war clearly are very complex, and their motivations are difficult to understand. But I think there are two factors that came into play that influenced many in the Austrian government who played a role in restitution matters. One was the feeling that the Austrians, were victims.
And in a certain way this was correct, because as a state, Austria was a victim because Austria lost its independence due to the Nazi pressure. But as a society, it was completely wrong, because the percentage of Nazis in Austria was about the same as it was in Germany.
And in 1945, the most important for Austria was to become very quickly again an independent state, not to be divided like Germany. So what the Austrians did was to use this first victims theory as excuse for not having to deal with compensation, because they were not guilty as a country.
With regard to art restitution, the interesting issue is that there was quite another form of reluctance to deal with the Nazi past and also try to block parts of the restitution issue in the art business. And then I think there were also special interests by the museum curators to keep their collections together. One should also remember that many of these bureaucrats who have not been in exile, and this was the majority, have served during the Nazi regime and were involved in a large number of issues, starting with so-called Aryanization of Jewish collections and also being part of the machinery trying to collect art treasures for the Hitler Museum in Linz or for other Nazi functionaries.
After 1945, the Austrian authorities did not want to return all of the cultural property that belonged to Vienna's, to Austria's Jewish community, and they came up with different tactics to keep the property. The key tactic was to declare an object as a national treasure, that it was so valuable it could not be exported, it could not leave Austria, and they required victims and heirs to keep the object in Austria. In return, the Austrian government said that they would grant export permits for other objects, usually less precious, less valuable objects. And this policy turned into a kind of corrupt business. The Germans, the Austrians called it Tauschhandel, literally a business in trade. It's an odd phrase, but it's really kind of horse trading, a kind of extortion, if you will.
Where people in power struck deals with people who were powerless, exiles, people who could not return to the country that had rejected and persecuted them and taken their lives and their families and their wherewithal, people who were in no position to say no.
The Austrian authorities did this fairly openly. I mean, they didn't conceal their tactics from the victims, the heirs, and their representatives. There was no scrutiny of this policy, no outcry against this policy in Austria until the 1990s. And in the 1998 restitution law, it was declared, the Tauschhandel policy was declared unlawful.
Let's return to the central character in our story, Maria Altmann. Maria Altmann was born in Vienna in 1916. the youngest of 5 children, Maria had a carefree and privileged upbringing.
I was very grateful to my parents that I was raised with such incredible simplicity, you know. I knew much later that my parents were very well off.
Her uncle and aunt were wealthy patrons of the arts in Vienna. Ferdinand, president of a large Austrian sugar concern, lived with his socialite wife, Adele, in Vienna.
Maria's aunt was a huge fan and patron of Gustav Klimt, and got her husband basically to buy a number of Gustav Klimt paintings, and commissioned actually 2 portraits of Adele Bloch-Bauer. I think what they had in their home, Ferdinand and Adele, 6 or 7 Klimt paintings. There are 6 that were mentioned in Adele's will when she died very suddenly of meningitis in 1925, 2 portraits of Adele, and then 4 landscapes.
I went frequently to my uncle's house for lunch or dinner, and that was the Palais in the Elisabethstraße in Vienna. And there I saw the Klimts. So I grew up with them because they were nothing so unusual for me.
By this time, Hitler and the Nazi Party had achieved absolute power in Germany. But they still had trouble with their oldest and most persistent enemy, the truth.
Germany neither intends nor wishes to interfere in the internal affairs of Austria, to annex Austria or to conclude an Anschluss. 21st of May, 1935, Adolf Hitler.
Only 3 years later, Germany annexed Austria as the first step in Hitler's plan to unify all German-speaking people under the slogan, "One people, one state, one leader."
When Friday, March 11 came, we had no idea then. It was rumored that Hitler's troops are not far from the border. But nobody believed that it would actually happen. And there was a chamber music on Friday afternoon as usual. And when it ended around 5:30, the then Chancellor Schuschnigg came and spoke on the radio that the German troops are at the border, and since he wants to avoid bloodshed, he has not given any order to shoot or try and do anything about it. And so Schuschnigg ended his speech with "Gott schütze Österreich, God bless Austria." And that was the goodbye and the end of the chamber music and the end of what Austria used to be.
The Nazis, when they came into Austria in 1938, immediately seized all of Ferdinand's property, seized his house and all the artworks inside, and took over the sugar company. Ferdinand fled first to his home outside of Prague, and then to Zurich, Switzerland, where he stayed throughout the war, and dying there in November 1945, just after the war had ended. Unfortunately, Ferdinand was not able, in the few post-war months, to recover any of his property, and so he left behind a will that left his estate, which at that point consisted of nothing but restitution claims, to 2 nieces and a nephew, and one of the nieces is Maria Altmann.
Ferdinand's heirs all fled to North America to avoid Nazi persecution. After the war, they hired lawyer Dr. Gustav Klimt to help them recover Ferdinand's property.
What happened then was he discovered that the Klimt paintings that Ferdinand had owned, several of them had ended up in the Austrian Gallery Museum. And he asked the museum what their position was with regard to the restitution claims. The museum responded by saying that they already owned all the Klimt paintings that Ferdinand and Adele had, because Adele had asked in her will that her husband give the paintings over to the museum upon his death. Of course, they were stolen before he died. But the way the museum put it was that they already owned it when Adele died, and they allowed Ferdinand to keep the paintings during his lifetime, which was really not true. But the lawyer for the family, Dr. Reynolds, didn't know it wasn't true, and he agreed with the museum to give up the Klimt paintings in order to get their approval for export permits for some of these other older Austrian paintings that he wanted to send to the family in Canada. And so he made essentially this exchange for export permits. And that was in the late 40s. So if you had asked Maria what had happened to these Klimt paintings before this whole thing happened in 1998, she would have told you that, as she told me, she said, well, my Aunt Adele gave them to the museum when she died in 1925, because that was the lie that the Austrian government had told the family after the war.
So when I first heard they were in the gallery, I thought, well, that's the way she wanted it, and that's the way it should be. And it only turned out later that that was not the case at all, that there was no legal way in which they ended at the gallery.
While serious questions had been raised about how the Klimts actually ended up in the Austrian National Gallery, the government saw things differently.
This is a case of Adele Bloch-Bauer and Gustav Klimt. This is a case of a last will of Adele Bloch-Bauer, and this is only in some minor aspects something to do with the history of the World War II and the time after World War II. But it has definitely nothing to do with Maria Altmann and her knowledge of the history.
Fortunately for Maria Altmann, Austria's new art restitution law opened a window of opportunity that had been closed to her for more than half a century.
Maria got a call in September of 1998 from Peter Moser, who was the former consul general from Austria in Los Angeles, later the ambassador to the United States from Austria. And he called her up and told her about this new law that was being passed that concerned artworks that hadn't been returned after the war. That law was passed at the end of 1998, and at that point, Maria and I really were just waiting to see what would happen. We got in touch with the Austrians, we sent them documents, tried to obtain, and ultimately did obtain in early 1999 a number of the documents that Hubertus Czernin had found, including Adele Bloch-Bauer's will and various documents related to her estate, which established beyond any doubt that the paintings were never owned by the Austrian gallery. They weren't donated by Adele Bloch-Bauer, they were not donated by Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, and therefore they were Nazi-looted property that should have been returned to the family after the war. Of course, they weren't returned to the family after the war because of this deal for export permits. So it was our view that the paintings should have to be returned under this new Austrian law. Unfortunately, then, when the advisory board that the Austrians had set up came to discuss Maria Altmann's claim for the Klimt pictures, they took what I thought was a really unfortunate approach. The committee refused to allow me or Mrs. Altmann to speak with them about the case. They refused to entertain any sort of discussion or arguments, and met in secret, and then decided to recommend against returning the painting, ostensibly on the paintings, ostensibly on the grounds that the paintings had been donated by Maria's aunt in her will when she died in 1925.
The question as to why the Austrian government, or more specifically the committee that was charged with reviewing these claims, rejected Maria Altmann's arguments and her claims for the painting. It's difficult to answer. I think one factor was these paintings were extraordinarily important, significant for the Austrians.
What is it that is so special about Gustav Klimt?
Just as Salzburg markets Mozart, if you will, Vienna markets Klimt.
I think Klimt is regarded as being one of the master painters of the late 19th and early 20th century. So he is now very much up there with Picasso, with Renoir, with Monet, with Manet, with Cézanne. One reason Klimt is so sought after is that he's a comparatively rare artist. There are only around 220 oil paintings by Klimt. And when you compare that to the hundreds, actually thousands by Picasso, it's a very small number. One of the interesting things about Gustav Klimt is that he created his own persona. After 1901, he started to design his own clothes, and he started to create almost a bad boy image. So he would wear huge embroidered smocks when walking around the center of turn of the century Vienna. And all this was part of the image which he created for himself as a womanizer, as a dangerous man, and as a man who was almost a rebel, but at the same time somebody who was selling his paintings for a huge amount of money.
Klimt was very much a ladies' man, and he painted with a long smock with nothing underneath and just his floor-length smock. And in the next room he had models with whom he constantly messed around. And there are oodles of little Klimt children went around Vienna and claimed they were children of Klimt, which is very possible.
Klimt began his career as a highly regarded painter of historical themes. When the Art Nouveau movement swept through Europe, Klimt helped found the Secession, a group of artists that rebelled against the conservative art establishment in Vienna. However, Klimt's increasing use of shocking and erotic imagery provoked a storm of criticism, and he eventually withdrew from the public arena to concentrate on a following of wealthy patrons, eager to have their portraits painted by the controversial artist.
It is artists that break ground and develop new ideas and new concepts and new images, and that therefore usually run into controversy during their lifetimes. It is on those artists that time tends to look favorably. With Klimt, it was these tough images and the challenging ways in which he chose to portray people that has given us the ability to look back 100 years later and acknowledge what a brilliantly creative and innovative individual Klimt was. The portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer from 1907 is now an icon of the 20th century. Clearly, it is from, if you like, the pinnacle of his career in many ways, and certainly does the identity of Klimt's sitter play a part? It does, because the Bloch-Bauer family are so closely entwined with Klimt's history, his biography. I think that the period of 10 years or so between the two portraits, clearly the artist's style has changed. The first one is very controlled and mannered, and I think still giving a very real likeness to Adele Bloch-Bauer herself, but presenting her in quite an abstract and symbolist environment, if you like, with the decoration to the rest of the painting. The style of the second painting is much more loose and free. And the second work, certainly the canvas is very brightly lit by these intense colors, and yes, flat blocks of color too, but with a much freer brushstroke.
When Klimt wasn't painting the portraits of Viennese society women, he would often paint landscapes in the Austrian Lake District.
I think that Klimt's landscapes are very arresting to any viewer. I think there are several factors at play. Of course, they're not all the same size, but the tendency to use a square format, the tendency in many of them to have no horizon. He's challenging you when you look at the canvas. Your eye is darting everywhere across this richly painted surface. In the forest images, where even though in their barest form it's tree trunks and dead leaves lying on the ground, there is still a sense of an intensity of life in this composition somewhere, and it's up to you to find it.
Since the copyright on Klimt's artwork expired in 1988, reproductions of his art continue to appear on countless commercial products around the world. His influence on popular culture is, to this day, unprecedented for an Austrian artist.
The Bloch-Bauer Klimts were so important. I think it was very difficult for the Austrian authorities to turn them over, and the Austrian authorities, I think, felt some public pressure in this regard. I realized this, but it was manifested in the interactions I had with Austrian officials. I met the Austrian ambassador to the United States several years ago at a conference, and he discouraged me from becoming involved in this case. And he suggested that that if I wrote a report that was sympathetic to Mrs. Altmann, that I would not be considered a friend of Austria. But I told him I was going to look at the documents and render my opinion, and you know, I felt that I had the freedom to write what I believed. I'm fortunate I'm a tenured professor, and that's what tenure is for, so that we can express ourselves honestly and openly, and that's what I did in this instance. The second key factor, besides public pressure, was the complexity of the case. It wasn't a straightforward case of theft and failure to restitute because of the existence of Adele Bloch-Bauer's 1923 will, and that added a wrinkle. You know, what does one make of this request from Adele, who actually owned the paintings in 1923 or 1925 when she died. But the existence of this will and this request added an element of ambiguity and gave the Austrian authorities a means to rationalize or to try to justify their decision.
I still have the feeling that at the beginning the government wanted to restitute the paintings, but there was, I guess, and as far as I was informed, influence from outside, from a well-known and influential newspaper publisher who told the government that he would oppose with his newspaper any restitution. So I wasn't there, but it sounds very familiar for me as I followed Austrian politics for more than 2 decades.
So you see, it's a political game, yeah? And it's not, that's the other thing. Everybody does, as it were, a question of law, yeah? It's not a question of law. In the last decision, it's a political question, yeah? But you need the law to have a sort of white card, yeah, to say, but the law, yeah?
When they passed their law in 1998 that was designed to return artworks like this, they said, well, the government is empowered to return the paintings, and they'll set up a little commission to look at it, but it gave no right of action, no right to participate for the victims' families and the heirs. It was basically the government was going to decide itself what it wanted to give back and what it didn't.
The Austrian government should have taken a much more active, transparent role. It still, I think, takes another generation to be much more free, outspoken, and quite to the point on this issue, and not try to pursue issues of Holocaust assets and restitution behind closed doors.
Of course, it's not possible to talk about the Holocaust and Nazi-era thefts without talking about anti-Semitism. The Austrian government was, understandably, very sensitive about this issue.
If you do not restitute these paintings, you show that you're the same old Nazis again. If you do not restitute these paintings, you have to face the situation that you're the same old anti-Semitic person like you ever have been.
the Austrian government is always feared that somebody can say you're anti-Semitic. So they made a lot of mistakes out of this fear, yeah? That somebody can say you're anti-Semitic. And also in my view, if you have this panic, yeah, it's for me always a good sign that you're in a part you are anti-Semitic when you have this panic. Yeah, it's a sort of paradoxy. Yeah.
I think the first reason for anti-Semitism is always in the need of the anti-Semites to find someone who is guilty. So the scapegoat role. But of course, as the Jews, after becoming liberated from discriminating laws, especially beginning with 1867, when some parts of the Jewish community prospered and became successful, this, as a secondary factor, created envy, hostility. Vienna was one of the most important capitals in Europe around 1900. It was a fast-growing city, the capital of one of the empires of Europe, and it was also a multi-ethnic and multicultural city, but at the very same time, it was dominated by a kind of German nationalism. And this implied some conflicts with the non-German speaking migrants coming to Vienna, but also with the Jewish community, which, by the way, was also mostly from non-German speaking parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And on the one side, this created a kind of very liberal cultural atmosphere, but at the other on the other side, it also created a lot of nationalistic conflict. So it was tolerant and intolerant at the same time, and the Jews, of course, were the traditional scapegoats.
They had no political outlet because they could not stand for political office, they couldn't become magistrates, they couldn't necessarily become court officials, but what they could do was to become patrons of the arts. So many of the great Jewish families commissioned operas, they commissioned people like Korngold, they commissioned Mahler, they commissioned authors like Schnitzler and Hofmannsthal to create new works of art, but most importantly they commissioned artists like Klimt and Schiele to produce paintings. And in fact, I would say maybe 80% of Klimt's patrons in the years 1900 until his death in 1918 were these great Jewish families. These families then went on very often to be the victims of the Nazis because many of them were Jewish.
All Austrian Jews, or people who were considered Jews, or people who were married to Jews, had to report all of their property to the so-called Vermögensverkehrsstelle. It was a kind of a Nazi public office that was charged with protocolling all privately owned assets by Jews. People themselves didn't necessarily have any kind of affiliation to the Jewish community anymore and didn't feel Jewish, were often, had taken on other faiths or were completely secular. It was not necessarily something anymore that was terribly important, but that became important retrospectively because it was used by the Nazis to expropriate them.
After the Anschluss in 1938, huge collections were dispersed. One particular family had, I think, over 20 Klimt oil paintings. The Bloch-Bauers had less, but they still had an enormous collection. The Lederers had a large collection, and all of these collections were dispersed after the Anschluss, after 1938. This not only had the effect of throwing these Klimts into the art market and throwing them onto the public stage, but in a way, the reason they were dispersed was that people were deliberately trying to cover up, they were deliberately trying to rub over the fact that these great Austrian artists, particularly Klimt and Schiele, but also Kokoschka and Gerstl, had been almost a creation of their Jewish patrons. They wouldn't have been so successful and they wouldn't have been so important in art historical terms had they not had these patrons behind them.
Hitler cared a great deal about art. He himself had been an artist, perhaps a failed artist, one would say, but art policy was an area where he was a very active dictator, and he played a key role in formulating aesthetic policy. Hitler abhorred art that was too abstract, that was not sufficiently realistic. He also dismissed art that was produced by Jewish artists or portrayed Jewish subjects. And abstract art and Jewish art was defamed during the Third Reich, or at least after 1937 with a notorious Antarctica Kunst, degenerate art exhibition that traveled around Germany. Klimt was not declared a degenerate artist, but the Nazis found many of his works problematic. First, because they were not sufficiently realistic, especially if one looks at his golden period, like the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer one. It's clearly magical and fantastic, and at odds with the realism advocated by Nazi policymakers and Hitler. And second, because he often painted Jewish subjects. But still, Klimt was given a place in the Third Reich, especially in Austria. But for Klimt to be exhibited, for his works to be exhibited, there were still some mental gymnastics, if you will, some changes that were made by the museum directors and curators. One was the so-called de-Jewification of Klimt's work, that the Jewish identity of his subjects was concealed. So portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer became a portrait of a lady. Her identity was concealed. She became an anonymous woman. And so in the labels, in the catalogs, the Jewish subjects were concealed. And so Klimt was recognized as a modernist master in Nazi Germany, and especially in Austria, but he wasn't celebrated in the way he is today, shall we say.
Given Klimt's celebrated status in Austria, it's no wonder that the government rejected Maria Altmann's claim to the paintings. But that didn't stop Randy Schoenberg.
I wrote lengthy letters to the minister, who was still in charge of this, asking her not to follow the board's recommendation. She wrote back that if we had a problem with it, we should go to court. So that's what we prepared to do, and we prepared to do it first in Austria, because of course the paintings are in Austria, and so we retained an Austrian lawyer to help us out and prepared to file a lawsuit in Austria. We have a 140-page legal opinion by the chairman of the Institute for Civil Law at the University of Vienna, a guy named Professor Rudolf Welser. He's the most famous and respected Austrian legal scholar, and he's written an entire opinion saying that we're right with regard to the law on Adele Bloch-Bauer's will and the events that took place after that, and that these paintings should be returned. Unfortunately, the way the European legal system works, in order to file a lawsuit of this type, you have to pay enormous court costs that are a proportion of the value of the painting or of the case, and what is at stake in the litigation. The court costs would have been about $2 million that Mrs. Altmann would have had to pay just to have her complaint heard in Austria at the outset. Of course, this was far more than she could afford. So at that point, we decided that it would not be possible or advisable for Mrs. Altmann to proceed in Austria. And so I began looking at whether we could actually sue in the United States.
The case escalated, and what remains at the end of the day, so to speak, is that the Austrian state kind of shamed this elderly Holocaust survivor, an elderly lady who fled from Austria, into suing a sovereign state, from another country. And I think that itself is such an impossible situation. Perhaps there wasn't an understanding that it wasn't something that they could kind of delegate just into a judicial kind of arena where it was going to be a legal decision, and they would have lawyers, and there was often this kind of this very blasé attitude. Well, so let her, so she, go ahead, sue us, and we'll see who's stronger at the end of the day. And this is a kind of an area where it's not just a legal decision, but it's very much a moral decision and an ethical kind of where you sometimes need to kind of take an extra step to do in order in order to do what is right. None of these people are personally responsible for anything that happened, but they are responsible from a institutional point of view of saying, this was then and this is now, and we don't want to continue profiting from that injustice.
Once the case made its way to America, there were a number of legal hurdles that Maria and Randy had to overcome. Austria fought them every step of the way.
I began looking at the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. It's a law that was passed in 1976 that regulates how you can sue a foreign state and under what circumstances. Because generally, foreign states are considered sovereign, and in U.S. courts you can't sue a foreign state. But there are exceptions, and this statute from 1976 sets out certain exceptions. One has to do with commercial activities. Another one has to do with cases involving property taken in violation of international law. So I looked at the wording of the statute and realized that our case could fall under that very limited exception, which is hardly ever used. And so I filed a lawsuit. Now, in contrast to Austria, where it would require hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, here in the United States, we have a system where it costs $150 to file a lawsuit. So we filed a lawsuit. It was a very lengthy and detailed complaint. Austria then moved to dismiss the complaint on a number of different legal grounds. The district court judge, Florence Marie Cooper, in May of 2001, denied Austria's motion in its entirety. She rejected all of their arguments. So we were very pleased with that, obviously. But then Austria had a right to appeal. Generally, you don't, but in sovereign immunity cases, you do have an immediate right to appeal. So they appealed to our federal appellate court for the West Coast, which is called the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Well, there was a procedure before the federal appellate court that the two parties are encouraged, they're not forced to, but encouraged to go into arbitration mediation. And you have to go through that process. And when this process came about, it was clear that Mrs. Altmann was willing to go ahead and do so. And Austria said absolutely not. And so they had their opportunity, but they, at that point, felt secure that based upon most cases filed against foreign countries being dismissed, either at the trial level or at the appellate level or maybe eventually at the Supreme Court level, that they were going to succeed, that Mrs. Altmann was going to lose, that some court down the line was going to find that American courts do not have jurisdiction over this claim, and then at that point, they wouldn't have to do anything. To their, I think, great surprise, this did not happen.
The Ninth Circuit heard argument and then decided the case in December of 2002 in our favor, again rejecting all of Austria's arguments unanimously with a three-judge panel. So at that point, things looked pretty good, but then Austria filed a motion for reconsideration, a petition for the Ninth Circuit to rehear the case or rehear it with a larger panel. And at that time, the U.S. government decided to get involved. They hadn't been involved up to this point, but they were concerned that the ruling that we had obtained in the Ninth Circuit could be used in other cases where people had been trying to sue Mexico or Japan or Poland or Germany, and they were concerned about the ruling that we had obtained and whether it was correct. So they filed a brief, the U.S. government filed a brief on Austria's behalf seeking reconsideration.
In litigation involving foreign countries, there's always a political component of that litigation, because at that point the United States State Department becomes involved, and the country that is being sued will put great pressure on the State Department, saying that, look, there's this case that is somehow affecting negatively upon relations between the two countries. In this case, it would happen between Austria and the United States. And so there is an enormous incentive on the part of the U.S. government to come in on the side of the foreign government as a way to improve relations or to get something as a quid pro quo. So in a sense, what happens is that the individual claimant that files a lawsuit against the foreign country is then sacrificed for the broader, greater good of foreign policy implications. I mean, at this, we're now dealing in the post-9/11 period. We're dealing in the post-Iraq invasion period. And the reality is that the United States needs as many allies as it can.
Fortunately, the Ninth Circuit did not reconsider and did not agree to rehear the case, so that made the decision final as to the Ninth Circuit. At that point, Austria then petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. Now, they don't hear very many cases, but this case did involve a foreign country. The U.S. government had been involved a little bit, and it also impacted several other cases where courts had disagreed with the Ninth Circuit's approach. So in October, or end of September of 2003, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. We argued, the judges seemed receptive, and then we waited. We waited about 3 months, I think over 3 months, and finally at June, near the end of the Supreme Court term, they announced the decision, and it was in our favor.
The Supreme Court decided that Maria Altmann was allowed to sue Austria in U.S. courts to recover the Klimt paintings. So a trial date was set for November 1st, 2005.
As part of the pretrial procedures, one of the things you're required to do is have a mediation. So we had a mediation. It started on the last possible day. They tried to drag it out, and started in March of 2005. And as a mediator, Austria picked, we allowed them to pick whoever they wanted, a professor. His name is Dieter Binder, a history professor from Austria, and which I thought was an unusual choice, but he turned out to be a terrific mediator and was able to talk both sides into coming to an agreement to arbitrate the case.
Their agreement to go to binding arbitration was sort of the least worst alternative which they had, because the choice was, if they don't agree to that, then the case will go to litigation, and they could lose. And at the same time, this is the kind of case that would be a very high-profile case. I don't think that Austria really wanted to have any more publicity as to what the Austrians did during the war.
And so we ended up going into arbitration with each side picking an arbitrator. Those two arbitrators then picked a third, neutral one. And then we had mainly written submissions. There was one hearing in September of 2005 in Austria, and then basically we just waited to find out the decision.
At the end of the day, the issues for the arbitrators remained the same. Were the paintings donated to the Austrian gallery in exchange for export permits after the war? Or did the gallery simply obtain ownership of the paintings according to the wishes expressed in Adele's will?
They found that the will was non-binding on Ferdinand. There was a request that he do something, but he wasn't obligated to do that. And so they said the will was basically a non-issue. And once we won that issue, everything else sort of followed from it. They found that the requirements of the 1998 law, which say that if an artwork was donated in connection with obtaining export permits for other paintings, then that artwork should be returned. So in this case, the lawyer for the family essentially gave up his claim for the Klimt paintings because some of them were already in the museum, and at the same time said, I hope that I can get your cooperation in getting these other paintings out. And they relied very much on a sentence in that lawyer's letter where he said, you know, I hope that I can expect your cooperation. And they said, well, even though there wasn't any formal agreement, there was clearly this pressure on him to make a concession with the Klimt paintings in order to get, and he was successful. He got most of the other paintings out with few exceptions. And their 1998 law is designed to reverse that transaction, to put the heirs back in the position they would have been had they not been forced to give up their claim. And so the paintings are going to be returned.
Following the arbitrator's decision, Austria was given the first opportunity to purchase the Klimts. Surprisingly, the government declined, thus ending Austria's quest to hold on to what they so often referred to as their national treasures. One can only wonder what Adele would have thought of her cherished paintings leaving the country she loved.
She had no idea that some of her best friends would have to commit suicide, died in concentration camp, forced into exile. She would have never, ever left a thing to them, let alone donate them. So it's insane to think that this would have been her wish.
In the spring of 2006, American philanthropist Ronald Lauder purchased the first portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer for his Neue Galerie in Manhattan, an elegant final resting place for the iconic woman in gold. Lauder paid a cool $135 million for the privilege, which at the time was the most money ever paid for a painting. 6 months later, the remaining 4 Klimts were sold at Christie's auction house in New York for $193 million. That's a total of $328 million for 5 paintings by a single artist, an astounding amount of money by any measure. But Maria Altmann's struggle against Austria was never just about the money.
There have always been people who believe that it is important to be proactive in trying to correct the injustices caused by the Nazis to the extent that one can. Lost lives can never be recovered. And I don't just mean life, I mean ways of life.
Art was part of individuals' lives, oftentimes passed down from generation to generation, and it has tremendous significance, emotional significance for family members today.
If it's important to a family to try to get a measure of justice for the elder generation and for the younger generation to connect to their ancestors, that they can go about it in a way that is less or more belligerent, but that they should do it if that's what they want to do.
We can never replace what was lost during the Third Reich and the Holocaust, but this cultural property represents some small measure of justice.
Do you have any plans, like any career change plans now that you've won the case? Do you want to do something different with your life, or are you happy with it?
No, nothing is going to change with my life. Nothing whatsoever. The only luxury I did, I bought a new set for my kitchen. But that's, no, I am not changing my life. I stay in this house, and whatever will come of it, I am only thinking of my children and grandchildren and whatever I'm going to do for charity and things like that.
If this case were made into a movie, who would you like to play you?
That's a good question. As I mentioned before, it's been almost 7 years, and my hairline has receded considerably. So I had a lot of hair at one point, but don't have it now. So I don't know if you have to take that into account. Who would I like to play me? That's a good question. I loved Tom Cruise when he was in the military movie, Top Gun. No, it wasn't, not Top Gun. The one where he was a lawyer. A Few Good Men. Yeah, he has that great summation speech. It was very, very, very impressive. But I don't know. Back when I had hair, people said that I looked most like James Spader for some reason. But I guess we have the same sort of hair color and look. But who would I want to play me? I don't know. You probably would have to make it someone a little more sexy if it was going to be a movie. But this would make a great movie, and there's so many interesting elements to it.